August 3, 1943. Sicily. The air inside the 15th Evacuation Hospital hung heavy with the smell of sulfa powder, sweat, and something else, that particular sourness of men who have stopped fighting. Outside the canvas walls, the Mediterranean sun was beating down on the dust of Nicosia, and somewhere beyond the olive groves, American boys from the 7th Army were still dying. Inside, a single ceiling fan turned slowly, doing almost nothing. At exactly 13:30 hours, a staff car pulled up to the hospital entrance, kicking up a cloud of white Sicilian dust. The door opened, and out stepped a man in immaculately polished cavalry boots, twin ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips. Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., commander of the United States 7th Army, 3 stars, 60,000 men under his command, the most aggressive American field general of the war. He had not come to give speeches. He had come, as he did almost every day during the Sicilian campaign, to walk the rows of wounded soldiers, to look them in the eye, to thank them, to pin purple hearts on bandaged chests. It was something he genuinely believed in. The men called these visits the old man's rounds, and for the most part, the men loved him for it. Captain Charles Eder, the receiving officer that afternoon, snapped to attention. Patton waved him off. He wanted to see the boys, the real boys, the ones who had bled. He moved through the tent slowly. A sergeant from the 1st Infantry Division, shrapnel in the abdomen. Patton leaned down, whispered something, kissed the man's forehead. A corporal from the 45th leg amputated below the knee. Patton saluted him. Tears welled up in the general's own eyes. Witnesses would later say they had never seen a commanding officer so visibly moved. He pinned a medal. He moved on. And then, he reached cot number 11. The man sitting on that cot was 26 years old. His name was Private Charles Herman Kuhl. Service number 355-36458. A rifleman from L Company, 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. He was from Mishawaka, Indiana. Before the war, he had laid carpets for a living. He had landed at Gala just 3 weeks earlier, and he had been in continuous combat ever since. But Private Kuhl was not bandaged. There was no blood on him, no cast, no visible wound at all. Patton stopped. The general's jaw tightened. He looked Kuhl up and down once, twice, and then asked the question that would change everything. "What's the matter with you, soldier?" Kuhl looked up. His eyes were dull, exhausted, sunken into his face. He shrugged, and in a flat, tired voice, the voice of a man who had not slept properly in 19 days, he gave the answer that detonated the bomb. "I guess I just can't take it, sir." For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The fan turned. A fly buzzed past. A nurse 2 cots down held her breath. Then Patton's face went red, not pink. Red. The kind of red that started at the collar and crawled upward like a brush fire. The hand that had just pinned a purple heart on a dying corporal, that same hand came up and slapped Private Charles Kuhl across the face with his own leather gloves. The sound cracked through the tent like a rifle shot. "You coward," Patton hissed. "You yellow son of a—" He grabbed Kuhl by the collar, hauled him up off the cot, and physically threw the young private out of the hospital tent, into the dirt, outside. 3 medical officers stood frozen. A nurse dropped a tray. And what nobody in that tent knew, what Patton himself would not learn for another 48 hours, was that Private Charles Kuhl was, at that exact moment, running a fever of 102.2 degrees. He had chronic dysentery. He had malaria. And the medical chart hanging from the foot of his cot, which the general had not bothered to read, listed a diagnosis in plain black ink. Exhaustion. Malarial parasites in the blood. Chronic diarrhea. The man George Patton had just called a coward was, by every clinical measure, a very sick soldier. But the general was already walking out of the tent, boots crunching on Sicilian gravel, convinced, utterly, righteously convinced that he had just done his duty. He had no idea at all, that somewhere in that hospital, a young army doctor named Major Charles Eder was already reaching for a pen and a piece of official letterhead. The report he was about to write would travel up the chain of command through 7th Army headquarters, through Allied Force headquarters in Algiers, and onto a desk in a quiet office where a tall, balding general from Kansas was, at that very moment, planning the invasion of Italy. The desk belonged to Dwight David Eisenhower, and the slap heard inside one canvas tent in Sicily was about to become the loudest sound in the United States Army. 7 days passed. In those 7 days, Major Charles Etter's report had been typed, signed, sealed, and dispatched up the chain of command. It moved quietly. No press release, no public statement, just a single sheet of Army letterhead, folded into an envelope, riding in the leather satchel of a courier officer headed for Algiers. George Patton knew nothing about it. He was, in those same 7 days, doing what George Patton did best, winning. The 7th Army was driving north along the Sicilian coast at a pace that astonished even the British. Messina was falling. Palermo was already his. The campaign that Eisenhower had quietly worried about was turning into one of the fastest American advances of the entire war. And then came August 10th. The 93rd Evacuation Hospital sat in a grove of dust-colored trees near the town of Sant'Agata. Different unit, different tent. Same Mediterranean heat pressing down on the canvas like a hand. At 14:20 hours that afternoon, the same staff car pulled up. The same polished boots stepped out. The same 3 stars caught the sunlight. Patton walked the rows. He pinned medals. He kissed foreheads. He cried briefly over a young Marine, and then composed himself. The old man on his rounds. Witnesses said he seemed in good spirits, until he reached the bed of Private Paul Bennett. Bennett was 21 years old. From South Carolina, a Sea Battery man, Field Artillery, 13th Regiment, 2nd Armored Division. He had been at the front for 10 months straight. His best friend had been killed beside him just 4 days earlier, a piece of German shrapnel through the throat. Bennett had carried the man's body back himself. Since then, he had not been able to stop shaking. His hands trembled. He could not hold a coffee cup. He could not sleep. The battery surgeon had ordered him to the rear, against Bennett's own protests. The young private had begged to stay with his unit. The diagnosis on his chart that afternoon read, in the clinical language of 1943, psychoneurosis anxiety state, moderately severe. Today we would call it acute combat stress reaction, or post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1943, it had a different name in the mouth of George Patton. The general stopped at the foot of the cot. He saw the same thing he had seen 7 days earlier. A young man, uniform intact, no visible wound, sitting upright. And something inside Patton snapped a second time. "Harder. What's wrong with you?" he barked. Bennett looked up. His lip was trembling. He tried to answer. The words came out broken. "It's my nerves, sir. I can't stand the shelling anymore." He began to cry, and that the tears was what did it. Patton's voice rose to a scream that the medical staff later said could be heard outside the tent, across the entire hospital compound. "Your nerves? Hell, you're just a goddamned coward, you yellow son of a..." He slapped Bennett across the face, open-handed, hard enough that the young soldier's helmet liner flew off the cot and rolled into the aisle. Bennett did not move. He just kept crying, quietly, which somehow made it worse. Patton slapped him again. Backhand this time, and then the general reached down to his right hip, and he placed his hand on the ivory grip of his pistol. "I ought to shoot you myself," he shouted. "Right here. Goddamned cowards like you. You're a disgrace to the Army. They ought to be lined up against a wall and shot." Lieutenant Colonel Donald Currier, the hospital commander, stepped forward quietly, carefully and physically placed himself between the general and the weeping private. It was, by every account, the bravest thing Currier did in the entire war. He did not speak. He simply stood there and waited. Patton's hand came off the pistol. He turned. He stormed out. And as he passed Major Etter, the same doctor who had filed the first report a week earlier, Patton stopped. Just for a moment. He looked at the doctor. The doctor looked back. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. Etter went to his desk. He began typing a second report. What almost nobody outside that tent understood, then or now, was the thing burning inside George Patton. In that moment, the thing he could not name, could not speak about, would not admit it even to his own diary. Patton's terror of cowardice was not abstract. It was personal. It was old. It went back to 1918, to the Argonne Forest, to a moment when a young Captain Patton had been shot through the thigh leading a tank attack and had, for a few seconds before the morphine arrived, lay in a shell crater convinced that he had wanted to run. He never forgave himself for that second of weakness. He spent the next 25 years building a wall against it. Polished boots, ivory pistols, a voice like a cavalry trumpet, a reputation for ruthlessness so total that no one, least of all himself, could ever look at George Patton and see fear. When he slapped Charles Cool, when he slapped Paul Bennett, he was not, perhaps, slapping them at all. He was slapping the boy in the shell crater, the boy he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. But that explanation, psychological, generous, almost forgiving, was not the one being typed up that evening at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. The report Major Eder wrote was clinical, factual, devastating. It named names. It quoted exact words. It described the pistol on the hip. And this time, when the report left the hospital, it did not travel alone. A copy went, by separate courier, to a reporter named Demery Bess of the Saturday Evening Post, who was traveling with the 7th Army as an accredited war correspondent. The story was no longer just inside the United States Army. The story was now inside the American press, and 800 miles away. In a marble-floored office in Algiers, the telephone on Dwight Eisenhower's desk was about to ring. August 17, 1943, Algiers. The headquarters of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean occupied a former French colonial building on the Rue Michelet. High ceilings, marble floors, the smell of strong coffee and cigarette smoke baked into every wall. On the second floor, behind a heavy wooden door, sat the man holding the entire Allied war effort in North Africa, together with both hands. General Dwight David Eisenhower was 49 years old. He had not slept properly in weeks. Sicily was almost won. Italy was 3 weeks away. And on his desk that afternoon sat 2 reports, one from Major Charles Eder, one from Lieutenant Colonel Perrin Long, the theater medical consultant who had personally interviewed every witness at both hospitals. Eisenhower read them twice, then a third time. According to his aide, Captain Harry Butcher, the general sat in silence for nearly a full minute after finishing. Then he reached for a cigarette, lit it, and said quietly, almost to himself, 3 words. "Oh my God." He understood instantly what was in his hands. He was holding the career of George Smith Patton, Jr. He was holding, possibly, the career of Dwight Eisenhower as well. And most terrifyingly, he was holding a piece of paper that, if it reached the front page of any major American newspaper in the wrong week, could fracture the alliance, embolden the Germans, and hand Roosevelt's political enemies in Congress a weapon they would not put down. But Eisenhower also understood something else, something colder, something strategic. He needed Patton. Not in Sicily. Sicily was almost over. He needed Patton for what was coming next, for the cross-channel invasion of France, the operation that did not yet have a name but which every senior planner knew was the war. There was, in the entire United States Army of 1943, exactly one general the Germans actually feared. One name that made the Wehrmacht General Staff stay up at night reading intelligence reports. That name was Patton. Eisenhower stubbed out the cigarette. He reached for his pen, and he began to write a letter. It was dated August 17th. It was marked personal and secret. It would not be declassified for decades. And it remains, to this day, one of the most extraordinary documents in American military history, because it accomplished 2 completely contradictory things in the same 6 paragraphs. It saved George Patton's career, and it absolutely destroyed him. "I clearly understand," Eisenhower wrote, "that firm and drastic measures are at times necessary in order to secure desired objectives, but this does not excuse brutality, abuse of the sick, nor exhibition of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates." He went further. He demanded that Patton personally apologize to Private Cool, to Private Bennett, to every doctor and nurse who had witnessed the slaps, and this was the part that nearly broke Patton when he read it to every single unit of the 7th Army, formation by formation, standing in front of his own troops. There would be no court-martial, No public statement. No press release. But Patton would be required to grovel. In private. In uniform. In front of the men. And Eisenhower would do something else. Something almost no commanding general in history had ever done for a subordinate in that much trouble. He would call in the 3 American war correspondents who already knew the story: Demery Bess of the Saturday Evening Post, Merrill Mueller of NBC, and Quentin Reynolds of Collier's, and he would ask them man to man to sit on the story, voluntarily. For the good of the war, the 3 reporters agreed. All 3 of them. They held the story for nearly 3 months. It was, depending on how you look at it, either the greatest act of patriotic restraint in the history of American journalism, or the most disturbing case of the press doing the military's bidding in the Second World War. Historians still argue about which. And then on November 21st, 1943, at 9:15 in the evening Eastern Standard Time, the dam broke. His name was Drew Pearson. He hosted a radio program called Drew Pearson Comments, broadcast nationwide on the Blue Network. He had received the story from a source he never named, and he did not care about the war effort, the alliance, or General Eisenhower's careful arrangements with the press pool. At 9:16 p.m. into millions of American living rooms, Drew Pearson said the words, "General George S. Patton struck and abused hospitalized American soldiers in Sicily." The next morning, the story was on the front page of every major newspaper in the United States. By that afternoon, the switchboard at the War Department was so overwhelmed that calls were being routed manually. Congressmen demanded statements. Senators demanded hearings. A bill was introduced in the House of Representatives calling for Patton's immediate reduction to the permanent rank of colonel and his recall to the United States. Mothers of soldiers wrote letters by the thousands. Some defended him. Most did not. In Algiers, Eisenhower picked up the phone. He called General George Catlett Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff in Washington, the most powerful uniformed officer in the United States, and he said, in essence, the following: "You can have my resignation, or you can have Patton's. You cannot have both. But I am telling you, as the commander in this theater, that we will need him in France. And if we lose him now, we will pay for it in American blood at Normandy." George Marshall was not a sentimental man. He was, by every account of those who worked with him, the coldest strategic mind in Washington. He listened. He thought. He hung up. And he chose Eisenhower. Patton was not relieved. He was not court-martialed. He was not recalled. But he was, for the next 11 months, frozen left to rot in Sicily and then in England, watching from a distance as other men commanded the armies he believed should have been his. He was passed over for the Italian campaign. He was passed over for the initial D-Day landings. He was kept on ice, deliberately, as a kind of strategic ghost, a name the Germans were allowed to keep fearing, while younger men did the fighting. It was a punishment crueler in some ways than dismissal would have been. For a man who measured his own worth in battlefield command, it was a form of slow, professional suffocation. And George Patton, sitting alone in a quiet headquarters in southern England in the spring of 1944, watching other generals get their orders for France, would write in his diary, in a hand that shook with something close to grief, 6 words: "I am being kept on the shelf." He did not yet know what was coming. He did not know that in just a few weeks, Eisenhower would unleash him across France in one of the most devastating armored advances in military history. He did not know that the Third Army was about to make him immortal. He only knew, in that moment, that he had slapped 2 sick soldiers in a tent in Sicily, and that the bill for those 2 slaps was still being calculated. The apology tour began in late August of 1943. It was, by every account from the men who witnessed it, one of the strangest things ever seen in the United States Army. Division by division, regiment by regiment, battalion by battalion, George Patton, 3 stars on his collar, ivory pistols on his hips, the most feared American field commander in the war, stood in front of his own troops and tried to apologize. He was not good at it. He climbed onto the hood of a Jeep at the 1st Formation, in front of the 9th Infantry Division, and he opened his mouth. And then he closed it. He looked out at the rows of helmets. He tried again. The men watched him in dead silence. Most of them already knew. The story had spread through the 7th Army within 48 hours of the second slap soldier's talk, And what soldiers talk about most is their generals. Patton's voice, when it finally came, was uneven. He spoke for about 4 minutes. He did not say the word apologize. He did not, strictly speaking, say he was sorry. What he said, and this was witnessed and recorded by multiple officers present, was something closer to a soldier's confession. "Men," he said, "I thought I would stand up here and tell you about our great victory in Sicily. But I am here instead to tell you that, in my zeal to punish what I thought was cowardice, I may have been unjust to some individual soldiers. I did not mean to. I want you to know that." And then, according to the witnesses, something extraordinary happened. Before he could finish, before he could even step down from the jeep, the men started to cheer. Not polite applause. Not the obligatory cheer of soldiers performing for a general. They cheered him. Loudly. A sergeant in the front row was heard to shout, "No, General, no, General," as if to stop him from saying any more. Patton's jaw tightened. His eyes filled with tears. He stepped down from the jeep without finishing his speech, and he walked to the next formation. It happened again at the next division, and the next, and the next. For a man whose entire career had been built on the iron certainty that his men would follow him into hell, the experience seems to have undone him in a way that combat never did. He wrote in his diary that night, in his cramped soldier's handwriting, "I had the damnedest reception. They actually cheered me. I do not understand it. I do not deserve it." But the 2 men he had actually slapped were not in those formations. Private Charles Cool had been transferred. Private Paul Bennett had been transferred. Neither one ever received a personal face-to-face apology from George Patton. Not in 1943. Not ever. The reckoning for them would come later, and it would come in very different forms. Charles Cool recovered from his malaria in the autumn of 1943. He was returned to duty. He fought quietly and competently through the rest of the war, through Normandy, through the hedgerows, through the Battle of the Bulge. He came home to Mishawaka, Indiana, in 1945. He went back to laying carpets. He almost never spoke about the slap, but in 1945, a reporter from his hometown newspaper finally tracked him down and asked him directly, what did he think of General Patton now? Charles Cool was quiet for a long moment. And then he said something that nobody, not Eisenhower, not Marshall, not the readers of the Saturday Evening Post had expected. "I think he was suffering from a little battle fatigue himself," Cool said. He paused. And then he added, "I do not hold it against him." That was it. That was the entire statement. From the soldier who had been physically thrown out of a hospital tent and called a coward in front of his own doctors and nurses. No bitterness, no demand for justice, no interview tour. Just one quiet sentence about a general he had every right to hate that contained more grace than most men show in a lifetime. Paul Bennett never spoke publicly about the slap. Not in 1943. Not in 1945. Not in 1950. Not ever. He went home to South Carolina. He worked. He married. He had children. When historians and journalists came looking for him in the decades after the war, he turned them away politely. Whatever happened inside the 93rd Evacuation Hospital on the afternoon of August 10, 1943, whatever the second slap did to a 21-year-old artilleryman who had just carried his best friend's body off the line, Paul Bennett took it with him to the grave. And George Patton did get his army. In August of 1944, exactly 1 year after the slaps, Eisenhower handed him the Third Army and turned him loose across France. What followed was, by almost every measure, the most successful armored campaign in American military history. 600 miles in 2 weeks, 400,000 German casualties. The relief of Bastogne in December. The crossing of the Rhine in March of 45. He died in December of 1945. A car accident outside Mannheim, Germany. He was 60 years old. The war was over. He had outlived it by only 8 months. And so the question that hangs over the slapping incidents 80 years later is not really a question about discipline. It is not really a question about cowardice, or combat fatigue, or military justice. It is a question about a man. Was George Patton a brute? Was he a bully in a general's uniform who finally met an inconvenient truth that war breaks human beings, and that breaking is not the same thing as betrayal? Or was he something more complicated? A man who had seen, in 1918, his own breaking point, and who spent the next 25 years building a self so armored, so loud, so brutally certain that he could never feel that fear again? A man who slapped two soldiers in Sicily not because he hated them, but because they were holding up a mirror he had spent his entire life refusing to look into? The records are clear on what he did. The records are clear on what it cost him, and on what it cost two young privates who never asked to become famous. The records are clear that Eisenhower saved him, that the press protected him, that history remembers him as a hero. What the records cannot tell us, what no document in any archive will ever settle, is what George Patton would have said if he had ever been forced to sit across a table from Charles Kuehl, from Paul Bennett, and answer, in his own voice, the only question that ever really mattered. Not whether the slap was justified, but whether, in those 2 seconds inside a canvas tent in Sicily, he had been hitting them.